And so we're going to look at this assignment. It says, let's brainstorm some experiments we could make regarding my business, Sterling Cafe. Okay, and so you really need to think about, well, what are some experiments that you can do? And then after this, so let's just brainstorm a bunch of experiments we can do. Okay, and so think about what you can change about your cafe. So you can change the color, you can change the price, you can change the items offered, you could change the music that you play in the cafe, music in the cafe, could change your website. So you could change a bunch of things. And then often, what would you do in that case? What would you study? Well, so you could the easiest thing to study, of course, is the sales. Sales, that's the thing you could measure. But there's other things you could do, right? So, sorry, let me make this a little bigger. There's other things that you can do. And so you can also do things that aren't quite as exact. So for a result, you could survey your customers and survey your customers as to their happiness and see if what you did made them happier. And that is, so as opposed to a direct result like the sales, you could do a result like that, which is, okay, we've changed the color of the cafe, and now we're going to survey and see if customer satisfaction is higher. Okay. Now, so that's a set of experiments that you can do. Okay, so you can say, all right, I'm going to paint. Okay, paint everything green, sterling green, and then check sales, and compare it. Compare with orange, and check sales. And you might say, well, this is not so practical, but in fact, you don't have to. When you brainstorm, you don't have to think about practicality at all, because it might remind you of something that is, something that you can do more easily. All right. And in terms of items offered, so you could check and just say, so the next one is price, right? And so what you could do is you could just change price, and then look at the effect on sales. Okay, so if you have a half price day, what effect on sales? Okay, so how much did I sell that day? And then you could say, oh, well, I'll have a 10% off day. 10% off day. And just do that kind of research. So how did my sales change? Now, there's other things you can do, though. So we're selling coffee, and what we can do is some other experiments. And since we're at a school, we can, for example, do an experiment like this. Okay, again, it's a world maybe where we can do things that aren't allowed. And so we run a test. So we have, say, a math test. Okay, and that is going to be what we give everybody. So we give, say, 0, 1, or 2 shots of espresso to students, then give a math test. Okay, and so then you can see that what you're doing is you're saying, based on the amount of caffeine they had, do they do better or worse on the math test? And so that would be a kind of experiment that we could run with our coffee. So it's not just strictly about sales. It could be about the results that you get when you do people are using your product. All right. So what are some of the other things? So if we do a music test, so you could test. So depending on the kind of music, and what could you track with that? You could track how long customers spend in the cafe. the time they spent or the money they spent. Okay. And so, and in looking at that, you could say the total, okay, or the amount per customer would be things that you could study. What you could also do is the noise level. Okay, so you could say so your input. So now I want to think a little bit about X and Y. So our input is how loud. Okay, and that's something you can measure. So there's a measure of that called decibels. You'll find that's very interesting because it uses powers of 10 just like the Fermi problem does. So how loud in decimals, and then you could say how it affects sales or number of people who coming, average amount a customer spends, like that. So you could do that kind of thing. So what is it about the experiment that's different, right? So there's a bunch of things we could track, right? So you can make statistics about, okay, so you could say daily sales. You can make a chart. So you make a chart of that. And so each day you could make a chart. And you might even, so there are some studies you could do, right? So you can study this and you could say which day, you could say how do sales change from day to day. Okay. And that's an interesting statistical question, but it isn't really an experiment, right? You aren't controlling a variable and seeing, right? And so here would be kind of a sneaky one you could do, is you could secretly add sugar to the coffee, and then track sales, or you could track customer rating of the coffee. Okay, so you could do an experiment where you say, okay, well, we'd like you to test this coffee out for us, and just say, well, and you could pretend, right? So often scientists will not tell the whole truth. Because they don't want to give away what they're doing. You know, just like if you have a Pepsi versus Coke taste test, right? So you do that. And so what you're doing is you're saying, okay, we're going to have, give free coffee today, but what we'd like you to do is rate this coffee. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you rate this coffee? And you do that for a while, and on different days you'd have different amounts of sugar in the coffee. So you could see if people actually will prefer a coffee that's a little bit sweeter even though they don't know it, right? So you're telling them this is just a coffee and you're not letting them know. And this is like the real world where, in fact, a McDonald's hamburger has a lot of sugar in it, sugar and salt, that you wouldn't necessarily expect. Okay, so what are some other experiments that we could do? And so you might try something like that. We're secretly adding sugar. And so, your question might be, does adding sugar lead to more sales of food? Okay, and so you're going to have days when you don't add sugar, and it's possible, indeed, that people who thought they're drinking black coffee and drink sweetened coffee find that increase in sugar leads to increase their appetite, which sometimes is the case.